Today, I am talking with Mark Blocher, who is the founder and CEO of Christian Healthcare Centers here in West Michigan. Mark has had a storied life where he began as a young farmhand on his grandparents' and uncle's farm and then went to work for the railroad. He became a pastor, a professor. He was the captain of the Chaplains Corps for the Michigan State Police. He is an entrepreneur and currently serving as the CEO and executive director of Christian Healthcare Centers. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. He has many, many nuggets of wisdom throughout his life that he shares with us today. Well, thank you, Mark, for joining me today in this interview. Kind of the first, you're the inaugural interview that I'm doing. So I've got three more lined up this week. So I hope this goes well. But thank you for joining me today. First question, just kind of around the conversation of leadership, is you've had a storied career with a lot of different professions and jobs that you've had, all holding leadership positions. And we kind of talked about that a little bit off camera. What is one of the, I guess, do you have a particular leadership style that you default to when you're dealing with your staff, or are you kind of a chameleon leader, kind of going wherever you need to?
Well, I think it's become kind of a cliche or throwaway line for some people, but to use the term servant leadership, I think really describes at least what I aspire to. I may not always implement that. There are times when you have to be more of a powerhouse and push people to do things, but generally, I define leadership pretty simple, and that's influence. And people don't follow title, they follow character, they follow integrity. And so for me, it's always been important to lead people with integrity, to lead people in a way that I'm not asking them to do things that I'm not willing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I worked, and did leadership training at the Michigan State Police Training Academy, and I teach sergeants and lieutenants that were looking to go out as post commanders or climb the ladder and get promoted. And I would tell them that there were people that are in positions that have titles, and if they went to their troops and said, "Guys, saddle up, we're going to go take over the Capitol," they would saddle up and they'd follow them because they're the kind of leader that has that kind of influence. And then there were other people that had titles that some of whom might even be post commanders would say, "Guys, let's go across the street and have a cup of coffee," and they wouldn't even go across the street with them to have a cup of coffee. And I think we all know people like that.
Yes.
People, if you try to lead from title, you're probably going to be too authoritarian, and you're going to be too, you're going to communicate the idea that you're always the smartest person in the room. My leadership style is really not that. I think if you hire good people, smart people, especially people that are smarter than you and have skill sets that you don't have, and then give them the freedom to do their job, and I make it my job to get the resources they need so they can be successful, so they can flourish. And I don't have to stand there and look over their shoulder. If I have to stand there and look over somebody's shoulder and make sure they're doing their job, I've hired the wrong person.
Yeah. I've often heard it said that if you have to tell somebody that you're in charge, you're not really in charge.
That's right. It's like telling somebody you're a person of integrity.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and I'm super humble too.
Yeah. Probably not a good idea.
So when you hire these people, how do you go about building a team cohesion between them?
Three key things that I use, in that whole onboarding process of bringing somebody onto a team. First of all, I'm looking for character. I can't teach character, but I can hire it. People have to bring that with them. And so I spend a fair amount of time, and I think in our organization now, we spend a lot of time really knowing what makes that person tick. What's really the driving forces in that person's life? What are their controlling values? Again, as I said, you can't teach that. They have to already have that. So character is paramount. And part of that is, are they a good mission fit with what the organization is about? Is it, are they willing to embrace the mission and say, "Man, this really defines what I really want to be involved in and be a part of"? Or do they express in one way or the other, "Yeah, I'm okay with the mission"? Well, that, for me, that's not good enough. You can't just be okay with the mission. You really need to have some buy-in that mission. That comes, I think, out of the person's character. They need to be a truth teller because I think it's important for me to be a truth teller.
Mm.
The second part of that is chemistry. And as part of the onboarding process, I want to know that the team that they're going to be a part of um, thinks that they are a good fit with the team. And I realize that the larger an organization gets, the harder it is to do that. But if you're going to build a corporate culture, if I can use that term, if you're going to build a kind of culture that really is going to be focused on the mission and the values of what the organization is there to do, then you need to take the time to have that person shadow some of the people on your staff, have them give you some feedback. I know here at CHC, there are certain people that I always make sure they have a chance to spend some time with a potential team member because I value their perceptions, their discernment of whether this person would be a good fit with the rest of the team. And then the third thing, obviously, is competence. Do they have the skill sets? Do they have the ability to learn new things fast? Do they have the ability to carry out the tasks and fulfill the responsibilities that you're asking them to fulfill if you hire them? And if you have those three things, at least at the start, then you can build on that by doing ongoing culture building and culture reaffirming experiences. In our case, we have quarterly meetings with the whole staff, and we spend a fair amount of time, in praise and worship. We spend a lot of time, working through what mission and values are and what some of the strategic pillars are of the organization, how we make decisions, and so forth. And it's always good to not assume that people are still embracing the mission. You have to remind people. I think you're an educator. And every good educator knows that there's one thing true, and that is that students forget what you tell them. So the importance of repetition is worth repeating.
Yes, yeah. There's a phrase that came up earlier this week in another conversation I was having, and I think it kind of applies that you can't send a duck to eagle school, but eagles can't swim.
Yes. Yep. I like to say that there's chickens, and then there's turkeys, and then there's eagles. And the chickens, they make a lot of noise. They pretend they can fly, but they end up pretty much just pooping all over everything. Turkeys, they like to strut their stuff and they like to puff themselves up. But they're so stupid that when it rains, if they're outside, they'll look up at the rain and take in enough water to drown themselves. And then there's the eagles. And the eagles don't need a group. They work quite well by themselves. They'll get along with people in a group for the most part. You don't have to tell an eagle what to do. So I always say, if you want to find out whether somebody is an eagle or not, throw them up in the air. And if they can't fly and they poop all over everything, they're not an eagle.
Wise words. Wise words. I think that's a really good analogy. Yeah. When I was talking with this other person about that analogy, we were talking specifically about coaching employees along. You may have somebody who has got two of the three things that you mentioned. They've got great integrity and they're really, really smart, but they just don't do something well. And we were discussing, can you coach them up to become maybe they weren't a duck, but maybe they were a pigeon. They could fly and they could do some things. Can you coach them into eagleness? And kind of the debate going back and forth on that. And I kind of fall along the lines of, I think if you have the right raw materials and they are willing to learn, I think you can coach somebody into eagle school, but you have to have the raw materials in place in order to do that.
I really liked when I was at Dallas Seminary in Dallas, Texas. Once in a while, we would have a particular Dallas Cowboys coach, Tom Landry, come in and speak to us in our chapel. And I remember him one time talking about how they make decisions about who to draft, in the NFL draft. And he said, we will never draft anybody that we don't believe has the potential to be an all-pro. They obviously don't all make it to all pro, but we have to believe that they have that capacity. And he said, you have to give them a few years to find out if that's really going to be the case or not. And it goes back to what you just said. Are they coachable? Are they teachable? Are they somebody that's just locked into their own abilities and, hey, I know what I'm doing, don't tell me how to do my job. And frankly, he talked about times where they had picked people in high in the draft, and they found out that they really weren't that teachable. They weren't that coachable. And so they would make sure that they found a way to get rid of them, get something in return.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Herschel Walker trade comes to mind when they traded him to the Vikings, and they got four draft picks, and they ended up with a Troy Aikman and an Emmitt Smith, and they ended up
Yeah.
with some pretty decent players.
Yeah.
But I think that's what you have to do if you're going to onboard somebody into your organization. You have an obligation to do everything you can to help them reach their potential. For me, it's not a matter of just what can they do for us, but it's also our obligation of what is it that we can do for them. And even if you spend all that time coaching them and helping them develop in their competencies, and they really become an eagle, and they end up going someplace else. Maybe they go start their own business, or they go off and work for another organization. You still did the job that I think God wants you to do,
Mm.
and that is you help that person become what God designed them to be,
Right.
and help them discover what their capacity was. And so it's not a loss that you've invested that time in that person. In the business world, the business people might look at that as a loss, but I go back to what Jack Welch was talking about at GE, where they talked about having a leadership engine. And the goal was to create as many leaders in their organization as they could, even if they went off someplace else and worked for a competitor, because the stories that they would tell about how they got to be that leader would
Mm.
always lead back to where they got that training and that impact.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Kind of switching gears a little bit. When you have somebody that maybe doesn't fit the mold, does slip through the cracks, how do you prevent or deal with those employees or staff members who don't fit the mold and may possibly create a toxic culture or a bad
Yeah.
climate?
When you have that particular kind of a situation, and sometimes life changes can affect a person to where they become toxic. It may be a number of factors that contribute to that. My philosophy, which sounds rather harsh on the surface, but my philosophy is once you've determined that someone is really not a fit for your organization, it's you know you hire slow and you fire fast.
Mm.
Um, if you've determined that it's not going to work and you need to part ways, do it fast and don't revert to being a social worker after you've done it. You don't do the nonsensical thing of, I mean, it's kind of like breaking up with somebody and say, well, it's not you, it's me. That you're a really wonderful person. If you have to terminate somebody, you just have to terminate them and then shut up.
Yes, wise words. So I guess let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So when you do have to terminate somebody, is that something where you just kind of rip the Band-Aid off and say, yep, we need you gone by the end of the day? Or is that something that you maybe have some preparatory conversations about, like, hey, I don't know if this is going so well. Let's talk about this tomorrow, and kind of lead into that?
It depends. If the concern that I have is that I misread something about their character,
Mm.
or they've given me reason to question their motives. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt until I have reasons to believe otherwise.
Mm.
And if I now have reason to think that maybe their motives aren't as aligned with the organization as I thought they were, I'll sit down and have a chat with them, and I'll say, when you were onboarded, we talked about these things being important to the organization, and you agreed that those were important to you. In fact, in our case, you signed some documents that said you were affirming these things, and I'm just wondering if you've changed your mind about any of those things,
Mm.
and at least give them an opportunity to speak to what my concerns are. And that usually leads to a deeper conversation. If it is a case of they violated the code of conduct of the organization,
Mm.
we can, depending on what it is, we can try to do some remediation. because again, I go back to what I said earlier. I want to do everything I can to help them flourish.
Mm,
And I can't expect a 21-year-old to have a 35-year-old's level of maturity in life. So I've got to give them a little bit of a margin for error, but I have to determine, is the error a competency issue and they just need some more coaching?
mm,
Is it a character issue? And if it's a character issue, then it's something that's higher on my radar screen.
yeah.
And so there are times though when you just know this is not going to work, period, no matter what, and you just have to rip the bandage off and say, we're going to have to end our relationship, and here's how we're going to end that.
Yeah. And I suppose that can be kind of a delicate dance as well, because sometimes there's a fine line between coaching somebody up who's got some good raw material and then becoming the social worker where you're like, oh, wow, this person needs a lot of work. And that's really not what we're here to do right now. So,
Yes. Yep. Well, again, I think it goes back to some of those controlling values of the organization, and that is, you can't just you can't treat people like they're a junked car and you just toss them out the door and say see you later. You do have to be respectful
mhm,
and respect their inherent dignity as a human being. It seems to me that too much of what happens in corporate America is pretty brutal, and
mm,
I've never been the recipient of any of that, but I've seen it plenty of times. And so you don't want to treat people that way. Even people that have, you know, they've committed some gross violation of the code of conduct. You still have to treat people with respect and dignity. Let them, if I can say it this way, they need to be able to save a little bit of face.
mm,
They don't need to go out with in shame, and you don't have to shame them. But when it becomes time where you have to part ways, you just need to do that fast.
yeah, yep, yep, agreed. Well, let's get into some maybe a happier topic. Do you have in your mind one or two leaders that you've ever worked for or have sat under their mentorship that really stand out as being pivotal moments or experiences in your life that shaped you?
Well, I've had several influences in my life. Some of those the influence has been more through their writing, through some of the books that they've produced, or seminars that I've sat in where I've heard people speak and then have had contact with them after that and watched them actually live out what they taught in the
Mm,
seminar. I had a couple of those. I would say some of the most significant influences I've had in my life. One of them was one of my relatives, an uncle, who was a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps. Started out as a 17-year-old after Pearl Harbor and joined the Marines and fought in the Pacific, and rose up through the ranks through
mm.
promotions and ended up a colonel, and was actually the aide to the commandant in Washington, D.C. before he retired.
Oh, wow.
Tremendous leader. When you talk about influence, that's the kind of guy. He was not the Colonel Jessup of the film. What was it? Feel Good Men or something.
Hmm. Yeah.
That wasn't Colonel Jessup. In fact, he was very offended by that movie because he said no Marine colonel would ever act the way he did in that film, but he was a man of tremendous influence in so many ways, not just in the Marine Corps, but outside the Marine Corps as well after he retired. But I remember he retired from the military and he became a farmer, and so he had a beef operation raising beef cattle, and of course along that raising the food that they would eat, and so I was cheap labor being his nephew, and I learned real early one thing I was not going to be when I grew up, and that was going to be a farmer. But watching him, how he led us, a bunch of young teenage boys, he had about 8 of us that were working for him, especially in the summer. And the way he led us, he didn't lead us the way you would expect a Marine drill sergeant to lead us.
That was
He
my
led
next
us,
question.
yeah, he led us as a guy who wanted us to really flourish in life, and this was a way for us to really learn how to be reliable, how to be dependable, take on
Mm.
responsibility, do your job, and not complain. And and he did a great job leading us in that. That's one that really stands out, and I miss him. He died when he was 97 years old.
Oh,
I just
wow.
died a year ago, but just one of those guys that just have fond memories of, even though he worked me like a dog.
Yes, but it's often the hard things in life that shape us. And he was one of the first people that you mentioned. So
Yeah.
obviously the hard work did you some good.
Yep. Well, if you're going to be a farmer, there's one thing you better like, and that's work.
Yes. Yeah. I know the Marine Corps has a very solid intentional leadership program. I have a friend who went through the Marine Corps, and I've watched some others through, social media. And the Marine Corps is very intentional about growing leaders, growing gentlemen, and growing people who kind of like what you said earlier. Once they leave, they take that with them wherever they go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like there are no former Marines. They're all
Yes.
Marines all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one that stands out. And there are some others. I mean, we had a director at the Michigan State Police who came in, and she was the first female colonel for the Michigan State Police. And she came in, and of course, as you can imagine, in that very high testosterone environment, there were
Hmm.
a lot of people that were skeptical about a female colonel. They were going to have to salute and
Hmm.
and follow, her directives and official orders. And she just exhibited that servant leadership that I talked about earlier to the T. Now she was able to be tough when she needed to be tough, but at the same time, the people in the field, the troops out there doing the field work, they knew that that was somebody that had their back. That was
Hmm.
somebody that was their advocate. And she would also jump in a patrol car, and she'd go out and she'd take complaints, and she'd stop cars and write tickets.
Mm.
She got right out in the field and worked with them, and that set her up for success because it bought her a lot of equity from the troops in the field, so that when she had to make a tough decision, when she had to change an official order that was going to change the way they did their workflow or whatever it might be, they
Yeah.
gave her the giant benefit of the doubt because she had accumulated some equity with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a similar experience when I was in college. One of my jobs was unloading semis at Sears, and we had two store directors. One summer, there was kind of a changeover that summer, and one store director would come into the loading dock and just kind of point around, and you do this and you do that, and da 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 da, and sling orders, and then walk back out. And we were kind of like, all right, whatever. Well, we still got to get the job done. And then the new store director came in. And he did the same thing. He's like, all right, guys, I need these air conditioners over there and that stuff over there. And wow, that truck's really full. And then he took off his sport coat, set it aside, grabbed a hand truck, and started slinging air conditioners with us on a 100-degree semi trailer. And me
Yeah,
and the guys in the dock kind of looked around, and it was like, so next week he came in and is like, hey Todd, can you go run over there and do that for me real quick? Yes, sir, absolutely.
yeah,
Because like you said, he had purchased equity and respect from us,
you
and
bet.
yeah, that was great.
Well, that's what why I say the core of leadership is influence.
Mm,
And influence is not barking out orders and using your rank, to command people to do things. It seems to me that the kind of influence that we're talking about is the very thing you just said, and that is that yeah, I would storm a mountain for you. I would. It's like the guy that was at the convention a week ago, is 90 some years old, a World War II vet, and he said, I'd like to reenlist. You tell me to what beach to storm, and I'll storm it. And that's the kind of influence that real leaders, I think, have on people.
yeah, yeah, they're willing to follow you. Well, let's wrap up with just one last question, and I don't know if you're going to have a single event, but is there one story or leadership success or failure that you've experienced that has been the greatest teacher for you in your life?
Um, well, there's been a number of both. There's
Mm.
been a number of examples of people that I have watched them fail miserably in leadership, and then there's people that I've watched succeed marvelously in
Yeah.
leadership. And I think in both cases, it comes back down to, first of all, character,
Mm.
comes back down to integrity, and the people that seem to fail most in leadership are the people who think that because I have this title, you have to do what I tell you to do, and they don't necessarily have the character to adorn their orders to people. I can't say that there's one that stands out. Um, I think that there's a pattern that you can see happening. It seems like
Mm.
with an organization where the leadership fails to recognize that maybe the organization has grown to a place where they need to step aside. I think that there are a lot of organizations that suffer because they have founder-itis. The
Mm.
founder that started the organization, whether it's a family-owned company or whatever it might be, they hang around, and even when they step aside from day-to-day leadership and operations, they hang around, and so their ghost walks the halls, and it really impedes the ability of the new leaders to really uh, become rooted in the organization and rooted in the future of the organization. And so there's that founder-itis that seems to plague some organizations where the leader needs to get out of the way.
Yeah.
If you're going to step aside from day-to-day operations, you need to step aside.
Mm-hmm.
You need to move on. I mean, I've founded a number of organizations, and when it was time to go, it was time to go. And if you've done your job, you're handing it off to someone who is going to come in and pick up the mission and pick up the values, but they're going to lead in their own way. They're going to lead according to their own style. And more often than not, what I find is a founder that sticks around, he ends up having problems with the person's leadership style, and he
Mm.
tries to step back in and make corrections. And you don't have the moral authority to do that.
Yeah.
You hand it off to this person. Now take your hands off of it.
Yeah, yep. I've worked with a client kind of doing that, going through that same thing where was a founding member, and that founding member is doing exactly what you're talking about, and just kind of waiting in the wings and giving suggestions and criticisms. And finally, I had a conversation with the founding member, and I was like, "You understand that they're doing things differently?" Well, yeah. Well, different is different. Different is not wrong. It's just different.
Yep.
And it may not be the way that you would do it, but just because it's different does not mean it will not be successful.
Yep. I was asked to come in and do a little consulting for a fairly large for-profit corporation, and they were in the midst of making that transition. They were handing off, from a founder, CEO, and handing it off to the next leadership. And I said, so tell me what your observations are about the organization. And he just rattled off a whole list of things that basically were complaints about the new leadership
Mm,
and complaints about what they were doing and how they were doing it. And, they had undone some of the stuff that he wanted them to keep doing and so forth. And he actually had it written down in a list. And so I looked at his list and I said, that's quite a list that you've got here. I said, but there's something missing on the list. And he said, oh, yeah, what's that? I said, you're not on the list. You're the biggest obstacle to this team moving forward and being successful because you keep dipping back in there and
yeah,
I'm going to give you the authority. Well, no, I'm not going to give it to you. Oh, I'm going to
yeah,
give it to you as long as you do it the way I want to do it. Well, why did you leave if you thought you needed to stay involved that way? You
yeah,
need to get out of the way.
yeah. I'm curious, what was his reaction to that?
First, he was mad.
Yeah.
He said, you're telling me, that you've been this here and you've been working with this organization for such a short a time as a consultant. And you came in here and you think that you know more about how to lead this organization than I do after all these years. So I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you that you've got all these complaints about what the new leadership is doing and the leadership that you selected, the leadership that you empowered to move this organization in a direction that you believed you couldn't lead it in or didn't want to. You've handed it off to them. Now take your hands off of it. You
Mm,
can be mad at me. I don't care. I don't need the job. It's not like I need to keep coming back here to get a paycheck. You hired me to come in here and tell you the truth, and that's what I'm telling you.
mm,
You need to be on that list of problems that need to be solved. Just take your hands off of this. And he did. The company it has flourished tremendously. They have grown tremendously. They're in 23 countries, and they took it in directions that he never could have taken it.
mm. Did you ever have a follow-up conversation with him and him kind of come around to see your side of things, or was that
No,
your last day?
well, yeah, it was my last day. Yep. But I did go actually get invited to come back in and teach some leadership to that whole new executive team. And starting with, what business are you in?
Hmm.
Let's define what this business is. And so we did some very basic stuff, and that was a fun experience. So I had an opportunity to speak back into the new leadership, but yeah, he wasn't all that appreciative of what I had to say. And at one point I said to him, I said, your reaction to what I told you is precisely why I needed to tell you what I told you.
Mm,
If you're having that kind of a reaction, then basically I must be onto something because your reaction tells me a whole lot about what your leadership style was. And the organization needs a different style of leadership.
yeah, yeah. I one my last question, and I swear this time. When you were having that conversation with him and he was getting mad, what was your mindset and emotional state while you were dealing with somebody who is mad? Because I think oftentimes as leaders, we have to rip the Band-Aid off. We have to let somebody go, terminate, have hard conversations. And there's a lot of emotion involved in some of those conversations.
Yeah.
So how do you keep that even keel, or did you just roll up your sleeves and ask him to step outside?
No, that's a great question, and I'll answer it this way. Um, One of the things that Michigan State Police teaches their recruits in recruit school is de-escalation.
Hmm.
And so the louder someone is, you're on a domestic and there's people screaming at each other, or you've got road rage thing going on, whatever it might be. The louder they are, the softer you talk.
Mm,
And what's interesting is that it brings the conversation and the volume level down considerably. It gives people time for that adrenaline to sort of settle in and not be so pumped up. Now, it
hmm.
doesn't always work. There are times when you have to pull out a taser and, put them on the ground, and then they settle down. But in a
At
corporate,
CHC? This happens at
no,
CHC?
we don't do that at CHC, at least not yet. You know, you don't ever want people to know what you will or won't be willing to do.
Right,
So
right.
you
Yeah.
don't want to say anything about what you wouldn't do. But to come back to what you're saying though,
Yeah.
in that situation, my response is to just be calm. Let them say whatever they're going to say. People sometimes, in this particular case, he didn't call me any names, but I'm pretty sure he wanted to. And my response was, listen, I don't have a dog in this fight. It's
Right.
it's not like I own stock in your company or anything like that. You asked me to come in here and do an assessment and tell you what I see. I'm telling you what I see. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to even believe it. I'm just telling you this is what I see for
Yeah.
what it's worth. People find it hard to fight with somebody who won't fight back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are cases where you don't have to fight with people. My grandpa had a famous saying that I've adopted a number of times, and that is, a dog can lick a skunk anytime, but is it worth the fight?
Yeah. You've got some great wisdom from the older members of your family. And sometimes when you just break things down into simple language, it really conveys the message more accurately.
No,
Well,
well, my grandpa was a simple farmer. He never went past the fifth grade, but he was filled with life lessons and wisdom.
man, you were surrounded by farmers.
Yes, well, our house was between both sets of grandparents, and One grandfather, the one that I quote the most, was a dairy farmer,
Hmm.
and he had every other kind of livestock, sheep and pigs and chickens and everything else. And so I learned how to milk cows by hand. And then my other grandparents had a beef operation and crop farms.
Hmm.
And so from about the age of 9, I'd be out there driving the tractor around, feeding cows, milking cows, shearing sheep, doing all the fun things that when other kids were out playing softball and baseball and swimming at the lake, I was working on the farm. And then my uncle came along when I hit high school, and my other two grandparents had at that point had retired and had sold off their farms, and then he went into farming. So I continued all the way through high school until I left when I graduated from high school, and then went to work for the railroad, and ultimately became a railroad engineer.
Yeah. And you said, I'm never going back to the farm.
I'm not doing the farming, that's for sure.
Sometimes life just helps you figure out what you really do and do not want to do.
That's right. Well, that was one thing I found out real quick.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate your wisdom, your insights, your generosity of time. And I know this is not the first time you've sat down with me and just had conversations about life and leadership and that sort of thing. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Take care.
Bye bye.